What do you want to be when you grow up? I know that feels like a question you only ask little kids, but most of you still probably aren't sure. For me, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Now, some of you may be too young to know of the movie Blue Crush, but this movie, honestly, now looking back, is super cheesy. But it's about teenage surfers who basically roam Hawaii surfing. That's literally the whole movie. But I saw it, and needless to say, I was hooked on wanting that life. The thought of playing with dolphins and sea turtles, spending my days on the beach or on a boat just cruising the ocean, trying to find cute creatures to take pictures of, obviously not realistic at all. But I was convinced that this was going to be my career. I wore tons of beachy brands like Roxy. I gave myself horrendous spray tans that looked like this. They always turned out orange, and I went to school like this, thinking that I looked amazing. I even begged my mom for this tacky neon blue, like collage picture frame from Walmart, similar to this one. And then I went on the internet, ripped off some pictures of sea turtles, waves, anything beachy that I could find, and it looked like a generic display that you would find at a shop in Myrtle Beach. Cringy is an understatement. And I actually recently went back to my old closet at my parents' house and found memoirs of this phase, and it was still embarrassing over 10 years later. Especially since clearly I'm not a marine biologist, I'm not on a boat near the Galapagos Islands, but happy is an understatement for where I am right now. I am an avid planner. Well, for most things. I try to have a plan A, plan B, plan C, but despite that, I honestly had no idea that I would end up working here at church in student ministry and meeting some of the best people that I know here, except Elijah. When this job aligned for me, I was about 20. And maybe you've thought about your eventual career or the college that you plan on attending, or maybe you're not there yet. Maybe all you're worried about is what you're going to do next weekend when Friday rolls around. Wherever you are, I'm here to tell you that no matter what you're planning on, life is full of changes. It's unpredictable and it can take a turn at any moment. I told you earlier that I grew up wanting to be a marine biologist, but when I finally got to college, I knew that I wanted to be a nurse. I did this for probably like 2.5 years, switched to history, switched to teaching, and ended up at VCU School of Business with a minor in advertising and communications. And then about a month and a half after I graduated, I ended up here, full-time staff at PCC. Lots of changes, most of them unplanned, yet they were all in God's plan. We make plans all the time that don't work out, but when our biggest plans change or feel uncertain, it's a really big deal. And that's especially true when you aren't only wondering about what your plans are for your future, but also asking, what is God's plan for my future? Figuring out what we want for our futures can be terrifying all in itself, but once you add in the question of what does God want, the pressure only increases. Does God actually have plans for our futures? If so, do we have a say in those plans? How do we find out what those plans are? Does he just tell us in a dream? And what if God's plans don't sound like a lot of fun to me, or they don't match up with the plans that I had already been making? When we're making plans for our future, we might think that we have a great idea like my 13-year-old self did, but I wonder if God ever looks at our plans and thinks, sure about that? In the same way, there are plenty of times we probably look at God and wonder the exact same thing. For me, it was when I went on my first mission trip to Brazil that was international. Elijah's absolutely amazing mom, Jackie, came up to me in the Powhatan campus kitchen and said, "Hey, we're going to go to Brazil in the summer and you should think about coming." I felt without a doubt a push from God that I was going on this trip. I had absolutely no idea how I was going to come up with $2,000 or even how to travel internationally, but it didn't matter because I didn't need to, because God had me, and it was in His plan for me. Now, up until this moment, I had a few nudges from God, but this was my first hard, defined moment like, you are going on this trip. But some of you may have never felt a direct push or a calling from God, and that is absolutely okay. If you've ever wondered about God's plan for your life, you are not alone. All throughout Scripture, we find the stories of people who are trying to understand, trust, and to follow God's plans for them. Despite the unknown, they put their trust in God's plan and experienced something incredible as a result. It also tells us the story of people who struggled to understand or trust the plans that God had for them. And sometimes, like we see in this passage from the book of Psalms, the Bible gives us a look into the prayers of someone who is reflecting on God's plan for their lives. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord, my God, are the wonders you have done, the things that you have planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and to tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. Now, we don't know what situation caused the author David to write about this song, but here's what we observed as a result of what he was experiencing. Even when life is difficult or confusing, God can be trusted. If we look backwards to the past, we can see that God has already done so many amazing things on our behalf. And if we look to the future, we can trust that God has many good things planned. Now, this psalm doesn't exactly say what God's plans are, but that is okay. By remembering the ways that God was good to him and his people in the past, David knew that he could continue trusting in God for the future, even if it wasn't sure what it would look like. We can see another example of what it looks like to trust God with our future in another passage of Scripture in Matthew, where we find a conversation between Jesus and one of his closest followers, Peter. Now, let me set the stage for you. Jesus arrives in a city named Caesarea Philippi, and he is asking his disciples, his closest friends, who the people think that he is. This is when Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And this is when Jesus makes a big plan for Peter, saying that he will build his church on this rock, and that the keys of the kingdom will be his, meaning Peter. In regards to God's plan, two interesting things happen in this passage. First, Jesus gives Peter some insight into God's plan for his future. Jesus promises that he will use Peter to build and to grow the church. But the Bible doesn't exactly tell us how Peter responded, but it's probably safe to assume that he was pretty excited about that news. But then, just a short time later, Jesus gave his disciples another look into God's plans for the future. And these plans definitely did not sound as good as those first set of plans. See, he then tells his disciples that he is going to go to Jerusalem and be killed. And this is where Peter jumps in and says this. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." I mean, what a turn of events. Like, seriously, Peter simply couldn't accept that Jesus would die. In Peter's mind, Jesus' death would completely change Peter's plans for his future. Plus, it seemed like Jesus was going back on his word. How could Jesus use Peter to build his church if Jesus was dead? To Peter, this probably didn't make much sense. But Jesus, of course, knew some things that Peter didn't. Jesus knew that his death was actually good news. Yes, his death would be horrendous and painful, but it would then be followed up by his resurrection, our salvation, and a new relationship with God, and the creation of the church. Now, Peter may have thought the news of Jesus' death was interfering with God's plan for him, but in reality, Jesus' death was an essential step in God's plan, not only for Peter, but for the entire world. We can all be Peter, though, sometimes. It's only natural to be fearful when the future seems scary. But I imagine Peter might have reacted differently if he remembered those words that we read just a few moments ago from Psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. Because if he had remembered that, he might have realized that even when life was difficult or was confusing, Jesus could still be trusted. And in the past, Jesus had already done so many good things on Peter's behalf. In the future, he could trust that good things were planned. Now, what was true for David the psalmist and Peter, the disciple, is true for us too. The same God who could be trusted with their future can be trusted with ours too. Now, even when God's plans aren't clear or they don't make sense, they are full of hope and promise for us. Now, you're probably not going to be able to just open the Bible, find a message from God telling you which job to take, which school to attend, or what to do this weekend. But here's what the scripture does tell us about God's plan for us. Even when you don't know the specifics, you can always trust that God's plans for you are good. What is something good that God has done in your life? For me, He gave me you all. He gave me a purpose and a career in student ministry. He made me a mom, a wife. For you, it could be going on your first mission trip. Maybe it's getting a solution or an answer to something that you've been struggling with. Or maybe it's making friends at school. I know not every single one of us is going to look the same, but now life may not always be what you plan or expect, but God's plan will always be greater than our own. We just need to lean in, listen for His guidance, and be willing to hear it because God's plans for you are always good.